Picture this. You're a Persian scout, hidden in the rocks above Thermopylae. It's 480 BC, and you're about to witness something that makes no sense at all. You've been sent to spy on Sparta's most feared warriors, the men who are supposed to be the final wall between Xerxes and Greece. You're expecting monsters, iron armor, blades being sharpened, men praying to war gods. But when you look down, you freeze. They're sitting in the dirt, naked, not training, not arguing, not even tense. They're calmly combing their long hair, oiling their skin, grooming themselves like they're getting ready for a festival. You blink again. These are the Spartans. You scramble back down the mountain, sprint straight to King Xerxes, and breathlessly report. They're grooming themselves. Xerxes laughs. He thinks you're joking, but standing beside him is an exiled Spartan king who doesn't even smile. He leans in and whispers something that wipes the laughter off Xerxes' face. They're not grooming for vanity. They only fix their hair when they know they're about to die. And suddenly everything clicks. What you saw wasn't relaxation. It was a ritual, a funeral rite performed before the battle even begins. Because those men aren't planning to survive. They're preparing to become a legend. Those men weren't planning to survive the week. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more long-form storytelling like this. And comment below where you're listening from. Because it's honestly incredible knowing we're exploring these ancient moments together, from completely different corners of the world, connected by the same curiosity about the past. Now, here's what most people don't realize. Those 300 men were never even supposed to be there. In Sparta, it was the season of the Carneia, a sacred religious festival. And during the Carneia, war was forbidden, not discouraged, forbidden. Marching an army during the Carneia was considered a crime against the gods, punishable by exile, even death. So the Spartan government refused to mobilize. They told the rest of Greece to wait. Wait for the full moon. Wait for permission. Wait while the Persians marched. But King Leonidas understood something the politicians didn't. Xerxes wasn't going to wait. And if Sparta obeyed tradition, Greece would burn. So Leonidas found a loophole. He couldn't march the army, but he could march a personal bodyguard. Normally, that honor went to young elite cadets, the best of the next generation. Leonidas dismissed them. Instead, he handpicked 300 older veterans, seasoned men, experienced men, men who had already lived long enough to understand what this mission really was. And his one requirement proves this was a suicide run from the start. Every man had to have a living son back in Sparta. He wasn't building a tactical unit. He was protecting bloodlines, because Leonidas knew what was coming. When these men died, their families would survive. Their names would continue. Even their sacrifices were calculated. When Leonidas left his wife, Queen Gorgo, she didn't beg him to return safely. She didn't cry. She asked for his final orders, and Leonidas didn't say, "I love you." He said, "Marry a good man and have good children." That's not something you say when you expect to return. He was already gone. They marched north toward the Hot Gates, Thermopylae, a narrow pass where mountains crash into the sea. And there, Leonidas joined a coalition of about 7,000 Greek soldiers from across the region. It sounds like a lot, until you look at what was coming. Xerxes wasn't bringing an army. He was bringing the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. Modern estimates place it around 200,000 soldiers, plus an enormous train of support staff. This wasn't an army marching through Greece. It was a moving city, a migrating superpower, a force so massive it could drink rivers dry. And when it arrived, it turned the horizon into a sea of campfires that stretched beyond sight. Xerxes waited 4 days. He believed the Greeks would run as soon as they saw his numbers, but they didn't move. So finally, frustrated, he sent a messenger to the Spartan line. The messenger didn't negotiate. He didn't offer terms. He simply pointed at the endless Persian host and gave a command. "Lay down your weapons." Leonidas stood at the front of his 300. No speech, no negotiation, no hesitation. He shouted back 2 words that became immortal. "Mollen Labe, come and take them." Now, to understand why that response was so shocking, we need to understand what Leonidas was staring down. Because movies often portray the Persians like a chaotic mob of slaves being whipped into battle. That is pure fantasy. The Persian military machine was the most sophisticated, wealthy, and technologically advanced force the world had ever seen. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claimed Xerxes brought over 2 million men, and that the army drank entire rivers dry during lunch. Modern historians have debunked the millions claim, but the truth is still terrifying. Most estimates settle around 200,000 combat troops. And in 480 BC, that wasn't just big. That was unimaginable. Moving that many soldiers required logistics that bordered on magic. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing for this invasion, and he didn't just march. He reshaped the earth. When his fleet faced the deadly peninsula of Mount Athos, where an earlier Persian fleet had been destroyed by storms, Xerxes refused to risk it again. So he ordered his engineers to cut a canal straight through the land. They carved a shipping lane through solid earth and rock for over a mile just to avoid sailing around one corner. Then came the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. Xerxes built 2 massive pontoon bridges, tying nearly 700 ships together with cables so thick they weighed as much as tree trunks. He covered the decks with wood and soil so the horses wouldn't see the water and panic. And then he did the unthinkable. He walked his empire across the ocean. Supply depots were staged all along the coast. Millions of pounds of grain stockpiled years in advance. This wasn't brute force. This was industrial precision. But here's the paradox. That size, that power, was also Xerxes' greatest weakness. Because an army of 200,000 men creates a ticking clock. They eat, they drink, they consume the world around them at an insane rate. Hundreds of tons of grain, thousands of gallons of water, every single day. The land couldn't sustain them for long. Xerxes couldn't simply besiege Thermopylae and wait for the Greeks to starve, because his own army would starve first. He had to keep moving. He had to break through, which means Thermopylae wasn't just a clash of swords. It was a clash of time. Leonidas didn't need to win. He didn't need to kill everyone. He just needed to stop the clock. Every hour the Greeks held the pass was another hour the Persian beast grew hungrier, thirstier, more desperate. Xerxes knew it. Sitting on his throne, staring at the thin line of Greek soldiers blocking the road south, he had the numbers, he had the money, he had the engineering. He believed he had the divine right to rule. And still, he was stuck. So he ordered the assault. But he didn't send his best first. He sent the Medes and the Scythians, conscripted soldiers from the edges of the empire. Many were lightly armored, wicker shields, short spears, brave men. But they were about to be fed into a grinder designed to destroy them. because the Persian Ocean was about to funnel into a space no wider than a country lane. And suddenly, the logistics didn't matter. The engineering didn't matter. The wealth didn't matter. Now it was just geometry. Leonidas chose Thermopylae for a reason. In the ancient world, geography was destiny, and Thermopylae was defensive perfection. In Greek, Thermopylae means the hot gates, named for sulfur springs that bubbled at the foot of the mountains. The air stank of rotten eggs and steam, and to superstitious soldiers marching toward it, the place must have looked like the entrance to the underworld. But strategically, it was a choke point. In 480 BC, the coastline was different. The pass was narrower, squeezed between the cliffs of Mount Kallidromos on one side and the Malian Gulf on the other. At the middle gate, where the Greeks rebuilt the old Phocian wall, the path was only about 50 feet wide. That strip of dirt is the most important character in this entire story. Because in military theory, it's what's called a force multiplier. It didn't matter that Xerxes had 200,000 men. He couldn't flank them. He couldn't surround them. He couldn't unleash cavalry or overwhelm them with sheer mass. He could only attack head-on, one column at a time, meaning at the point of contact. The odds weren't 200,000 versus 7,000. They were 100 Persians versus 100 Greeks. And in a fair fight, Leonidas liked his chances. And standing behind that wall wasn't just Sparta, it was a coalition. Men from Tegea, Mantinea, Corinth, Phocis, 400 Thebans whose loyalty was questionable, and 700 Thespians who would prove, in the end, to be among the bravest men who ever lived. Leonidas organized them into rotations. The Spartans held the front, the deadliest position, then cycled back while the allies stepped forward, keeping the line fresh. They locked shields. Bronze and wood interlocked into a wall spanning the entire pass. The Persians saw the red cloaks, chosen so blood wouldn't show. They heard the rhythmic chanting of battle hymns, and then Xerxes gave the signal. The first wave surged forward, a roar meant to shatter courage. But the Greeks didn't roar back. They didn't charge. They stood silent, knees bent, shields locked, spears leveled. And when the Persians slammed into that line, it was like a car crash. Wood cracking, metal screaming, bodies crushed under the pressure of the crowd behind them. And yet, the Greek line didn't break. The hot gates had closed, and what followed was not a battle in the cinematic sense. It was industrial slaughter. And to understand why, we have to look at the terrifying design of the Spartan fighting machine. Because when the next wave arrived, it wasn't just soldiers, it was physics. And the Persians were about to discover what happens when speed collides with discipline. The collision at Thermopylae wasn't heroic in the way movies like to imagine it. It wasn't graceful sword duels or dramatic slow-motion kills. It was mechanical, cold, industrial. Because what was happening inside that narrow pass was not a test of courage alone. It was a test of engineering. Two different military philosophies had just slammed into each other. On one side, speed and mobility. On the other, weight and discipline. The Persian army was designed for the wide-open plains of Asia. They were light, fast, and flexible. Their doctrine relied on archers to soften an enemy from a distance, then quick infantry to close the gap and finish the job. Their armor was quilted linen or fish-scale iron sewn onto leather. Their shields were wicker, woven branches that could deflect arrows but shattered under heavy impact. Their spears were shorter. Their swords were basically daggers. They were built to chase down fleeing enemies, not crack open a metal shell. The Greeks, and especially the Spartans, were designed for one thing: the collision. They were hoplites, named after their hoplon, a massive concave shield made of wood, reinforced with bronze. It weighed close to 20 pounds. And when a Spartan stood in formation, that shield didn't just protect him, it protected the man beside him. His left side was covered by his own shield. His right side was covered by the next man's shield, meaning the phalanx wasn't just a line of individuals, it was a single organism, a moving wall. But there was a terrifying requirement. This system only worked if no one ran. If one man broke, the wall broke, and Spartans didn't break. The Persians discovered that instantly, because the Spartans were fighting with the dory, a spear 7 to 9 feet long. The Persian spears were significantly shorter. That difference doesn't sound dramatic until you're on the front line, because in that narrow lane, it becomes mathematical. The Persians were dying before they could even reach the Greeks. Imagine being in the first row of the Persian attack. You're pushing forward, not even fully in control of your body, because thousands of men behind you are driving you into the fight like a living battering ram. And ahead of you, you don't see faces. You see bronze shields, no gaps, no fear. And then, out of that bronze wall, spear points stab with the rhythmic precision of a sewing machine. Left, right, forward, withdraw. Again, again, again. You try to grab a spear shaft to snap it, and the Spartan simply shifts his grip and drives the other end into your throat. Because the dory isn't just a spear. On the back end is a bronze spike called the saurator, the lizard killer, a secondary weapon designed to finish off wounded enemies on the ground, which tells you something chilling about Spartan warfare. They didn't just plan to fight, they planned to clean up, and as Persian bodies piled up, they became an obstacle, a literal mound of dead blocking the feet of the men behind them. So the Greeks stepped forward, pushing the corpses aside with their shields, clearing space, maintaining footing. It was the othismos, the great shove, not individual combat, a rugby scrum of death. Rows behind pushed into rows ahead, driving the bronze wall forward like a bulldozer. The pressure was so intense men could be crushed without ever being hit by a weapon. Ribs snapped under the weight, breath squeezed from lungs. People died standing up, suffocated by mass. For the Persians, it was hell. Wicker shields shattered. Daggers couldn't penetrate bronze breastplates. They were fighting faceless warriors hidden behind metal helmets who never screamed, never flinched, never stopped stabbing. Herodotus tells us Xerxes, sitting on his golden throne watching from a nearby hill, jumped to his feet 3 times in terror. Not because his life was in danger, but because his worldview was collapsing. He was the king of kings. His army was supposed to be unstoppable, and yet he was watching it get threshed like wheat. By afternoon, the first wave broke. The Medes and Scythians retreated, leaving thousands of bodies in the pass. The ground slick with blood, the air thick with the iron smell of gore and the sulfur stench of the hot springs. The Spartans cleaned their blades, drank water, rotated the line. They hadn't even unleashed their full brutality yet, because they knew the first wave was just the opening act. Xerxes wouldn't accept this humiliation, and then the dust rose again. The king was done sending conscripts. He was sending his elite, the immortals. As the sun dipped low on that first day, a strange hush fell over the Persian ranks. The chaotic shouts of the conscripts faded, and from the Persian camp came a new sound, disciplined marching. 10,000 men moving in perfect rhythm, like a single organism, the immortals. They weren't called immortals because they couldn't die. They were called immortals because their unit strength was never allowed to fall below 10,000. If one man died, another immediately replaced him. To the enemy, it looked like a hydra, a force that regenerated endlessly. They marched in silence, their faces covered by cloth cowls, hiding everything but their eyes. They wore gold jewelry beneath their robes, symbols of rank and wealth. They carried the finest weapons the empire could produce. These weren't just soldiers. They were Xerxes' shadows, the men who had conquered the known world. Xerxes sat back, confident this would end it. The Spartans were tired now, covered in gore. Dehydration was setting in. Surely the immortals would simply walk over them. But when the elite entered the hot gates, they hit the same problem that destroyed the conscripts. The immortals were trained for open field maneuvering, to dance around an enemy, to use speed, angles, and flexibility. But inside the pass, there was no room to dance. The Spartans saw them and recognized the threat. The immortals were heavier than the first wave, better armored with iron scales beneath their tunics. But the core imbalance remained. Shorter spears, wicker shields, and so the collision became a grinding stalemate. The immortals attacked with suicidal bravery. They grabbed spear shafts with bare hands, tried to crawl under shields, tried to hamstring Greeks through gaps. But the phalanx wasn't a line, it was a machine. And machines don't panic. The Spartans stabbed, pushed, stepped forward, their heavy shields smashing into Persian faces. The immortals stumbled, regrouped, surged again, and then the Spartans did something that looked like disaster. They broke. Suddenly, the Greek line shattered. The Spartans turned and ran, a panicked, disorganized mob retreating deeper into the pass. The immortals erupted with triumph. Their invincible enemy was finally fleeing, so they abandoned their disciplined formation and charged forward to cut them down. And that's the moment the trap snapped shut. Because Spartan retreat wasn't cowardice, it was bait. At a silent signal, the fleeing men planted their feet, spun around 180 degrees in perfect unison, and lowered their spears. The immortals, now a disorganized crowd sprinting full speed, ran straight into a fresh wall of spear points. The slaughter was catastrophic. Momentum became a weapon. The Persians couldn't stop, couldn't regain formation. They were impaled by the dozens, and the Spartans didn't just do it once. They did it again and again. They toyed with the immortals, using Persian aggression against them. It was psychological warfare, a masterclass in discipline. Numbers didn't matter, only cohesion. By evening, the immortals retreated. The psychological impact on the Persian camp was devastating. These were the gods of war, the untouchables, and they'd been beaten by tired old men. That night, the mood in Xerxes' camp turned poisonous. He wasn't jumping from his throne anymore. He was paralyzed. He had thrown mass at the Greeks, failed. He had thrown elites at the Greeks, failed. Options were running out. But while the Spartans tended wounds and ate meager rations, a tragedy was unfolding in the darkness above them. Because the Greeks were about to lose the one battle they couldn't win with spears. The battle of information. A local man was making his way toward the Persian camp. A shepherd, not a warrior, not a general. Just a man with knowledge worth more than an army. His name was Ephialtes. In pop culture, Ephialtes is often portrayed as a twisted monster, a deformed outcast rejected by Spartans. That's a dramatic invention. The real Ephialtes was worse, because he wasn't a monster. He was just ordinary, a man who wanted money. He looked at the slaughter, looked at Xerxes' desperation, and saw an opportunity. He approached the Persian commanders and offered what they had been praying for. Away around the wall, high in the mountains above Thermopylae, was an old goat track known as the Anopeia Path. It snaked through the forests of Mount Kallidromos and dropped down behind the Greek position. Steep, hidden, hard to travel, but passable. And for a bag of gold, Ephialtes offered to guide them. Xerxes didn't hesitate. He detached the immortals, the same men humiliated hours earlier, and sent them up the mountain under cover of night. Imagine that climb. Thousands of elite soldiers moving through pitch-black forest, guided by a traitor. The path carpeted with dry oak leaves. Herodotus gives a chilling detail. The night was so still. The sound of all those feet crunching leaves sounded like a roaring wind moving through the trees. Leonidas had anticipated this. He stationed 1,000 Phocian hoplites to guard the path. They were supposed to be the cork in the bottle. If they held, the Spartans below were safe. But when the Phocians heard the crunching and saw the torches emerging from the woods, they panicked. The Phocian commander assumed the Persians were coming to annihilate them, so they retreated to the top of a nearby hill and formed a defensive circle, preparing for a last stand. And without realizing it, they abandoned the path. Hydanes, the Persian commander, saw it immediately. He ordered his archers to fire a few volleys to keep the Phocians pinned down, and then simply marched past them. Ignored them completely. The Phocians stood on their hill, watching in horror as the immortals streamed down the trail toward the sea, toward the rear of the Spartan line, toward the hot gates, toward the trap. And before dawn, runners burst into Leonidas's camp. The news was grim. The seers examined the sacrifice and predicted death, and lookouts confirmed the worst. "The Persians are behind us!" The pincers had closed. The geography that had saved them was now turning into their coffin. The hot gates were no longer a shield. They were a tomb. And at dawn on the third day, Leonidas would face the hardest decision of his life. Because now, the battle wasn't about holding the pass anymore. It was about choosing who would die and who would live. Dawn. Day 3. The air was cold, but the news was colder. Scouts stumbled into the Greek camp, breathless, pale, and shaking. The immortals were descending the mountain. The trap had snapped shut. Thermopylae, the place that had protected them like a shield for 2 days, was now working against them. The hot gates weren't a choke point anymore. They were a coffin. Leonidas gathered the commanders for a final council of war, and this is where the legend usually gets simplified. Most versions make it sound like he ordered everyone to stay and fight to the death, but that's not what happened. Leonidas looked at the faces of his allies, men from Corinth, Arcadia, Phocis, and more. They had fought bravely. They had held the line. But now staying meant certain death. And Leonidas wasn't an idiot. He was a strategist. So he did something that proves he understood the bigger war. He ordered the majority of the Greek force to leave. Retreat south, regroup, protect their cities, because Greece would need every sword for the battles still to come. There was no point in throwing away 7,000 lives when 1,500 could achieve the same purpose. But Leonidas himself could not leave. Spartan law was explicit. Retreat was not an option. A Spartan king did not run. And there was another weight pressing down on him, a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi delivered months earlier. Either your glorious city will be sacked by the Persians, or Sparta will mourn the death of a king. Leonidas chose to become the sacrifice. not because he loved death, but because he understood what his death could buy. And here's where the history books and Hollywood commit the greatest injustice of the Thermopylae story. They tell us it was 300 Spartans standing alone. It wasn't. When the dust settled from the retreating allies, Leonidas realized he wasn't alone at all. 700 men from the city of Thespiae refused to leave. Led by their general Demophilus, they chose to stay and die beside the Spartans. And we need to pause here. Because the Spartans were raised for war. They were built for this. They lived their whole lives preparing for one perfect death. The Thespians were not. They weren't bred in barracks. They were citizens, farmers, craftsmen, men with families who had no law forcing them to stay, no prophecy demanding it. And unlike Sparta, their city wasn't hidden safely behind a peninsula. Thespiae lay directly in Xerxes' path. By staying here, those men were essentially guaranteeing their homes would burn. Yet they stayed anyway. Not for glory, not for duty, for something far rarer. Because they believed it was the right thing to do. There were also 400 Thebans who remained, though history argues whether they stayed as volunteers or as hostages meant to guarantee Theban loyalty. And then there were the Helots, the enslaved Spartan laborers and light infantry, who likely stood and died in the hundreds, mostly erased from history. So no, it wasn't 300 against the world. It was roughly 1,500 men facing a tsunami. And as the sun rose, the realization settled over them like a weight. There would be no rotations today, no relief, no second line, no escape. Leonidas gathered the men. He didn't offer them hope. He didn't promise a miracle. He offered them clarity. According to legend, he delivered one of the coldest lines in military history. "Eat a good breakfast, men, for tonight we dine in Hades." It wasn't a rallying cry. It was acceptance. They weren't fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the body count. The mission had changed. The goal was no longer holding the pass. The goal was trauma. To make Xerxes pay such a brutal price for these last few yards of dirt that his army would never forget the name of Sparta. Shields were tightened, the last drops of water shared, and the Spartans, the Thespians, and the remaining Thebans turned toward the Persian Ocean one last time. On day 3, Thermopylae became something else entirely. The tactical game was over. There was no longer any need to preserve energy. There was only one objective left: take as many Persians with them as possible before the end. Leonidas ordered the defenders to abandon the safety of the rebuilt Phocian wall. They marched forward into the wider part of the pass, a suicidal move, but deliberate. Because in a wider space they could engage more enemies at once. They didn't wait for the Persians to strike. They charged. This wasn't a phalanx anymore. It was a brawl. The Greeks crashed into Persian lines like men already dead. They drove enemies backward, toppled them into the sea, trampled them into the mud. Herodotus tells us Persian commanders had to stand behind their own men with whips, lashing them forward, forcing them to close with these demons. And in that furious chaos, the inevitable happened. Leonidas fell, not in some cinematic final stand, not with a monologue. History is uglier than that. He likely died early, pierced by arrows or spears in the crush. But his death sparked the fiercest struggle of the entire battle. Because in Greek warfare, the body of a king was sacred. To lose it to the enemy was a disgrace worse than defeat. So when Leonidas fell, the Spartans surged forward. Not for ground, not for victory, for his corpse. It became an Iliad scene in real life. 4 times the Persians tried to drag the body away, and 4 times the Greeks hacked them back. They fought through piles of dead to retrieve their fallen king, and against all odds, they succeeded. They dragged Leonidas back, a final act of loyalty to the man who led them into hell. But now the weapons were failing. The heavy dory spears had shattered long ago, so the men drew their xiphos, short, leaf-shaped swords meant for close-quarters butchery. They hacked until blades dulled, until steel snapped. And then, the most chilling phase of the battle began. Herodotus wrote a sentence that still haunts historians. When their spears were broken and their swords were gone, they fought with their hands and their teeth. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were animals. They punched armored men, strangled them with bare hands, bit at throats and faces. The Persians, even with overwhelming numbers, began to hesitate. They were afraid to get close. Slowly, the weight of bodies and mass pushed the surviving Greeks back toward the wall, and finally, they retreated to a small hillock known today as Colonus Hill. They formed a tight circle. The immortals arrived from the rear, sealing the trap. The Greeks were surrounded, completely. Xerxes had seen enough. He didn't want to lose any more men in hand-to-hand combat against these madmen, so he gave the order: pull back. The Persian army stepped away, and the archers moved forward. Thousands of them. They raised their bows, and the sky went dark. The end didn't come with a bang. It came with a whisper, the sound of arrows falling like rain. The last Spartans and Thespians didn't die charging. They died huddled together, buried under iron. When the last bowstring snapped and the dust settled, a heavy silence fell over the pass. The hot gates were finally open, but the price was astronomical. On Colonus Hill, the bodies were so thickly covered in arrows they looked like a bristling forest. That isn't metaphor. In 1939, archaeologists excavated that exact hill and found thousands of Persian bronze arrowheads buried in the soil. You can still see them in museums today, twisted, corroded proof of the storm that ended the resistance. Xerxes walked through the battlefield. The sight must have turned his stomach. He had won, but at a horrifying cost. An estimated 20,000 Persians dead against a force that was a fraction of his size. Among those dead were 2 of his brothers, and countless nobles. Herodotus says Xerxes was so terrified his own army would see the scale of the disaster that he ordered a cover-up. Trenches were dug. Most Persian dead were quickly buried. Only about 1,000 bodies were left visible. He wanted the fleet and reinforcements to believe this victory had been easy. It may be the first recorded case of large-scale military propaganda spin in history. But his deepest rage was reserved for one man. When Persian soldiers finally identified Leonidas's body, they brought the news to Xerxes. In Persian culture, bravery was usually respected. A valiant enemy king would often be honored in death, but not this time. 3 days of humiliation, the loss of his brothers, the shattering of his aura, something in Xerxes had broken. So he ordered Leonidas's head cut off and his body crucified, impaled on a stake for all to see. It was a shocking violation of religious law and wartime custom, a taboo. And it wasn't strength, it was weakness, a tantrum, because Xerxes couldn't defeat Leonidas's spirit, so he tried to destroy his legend. As the Persian army prepared to march south toward Athens, leaving the mutilated body behind, a terrifying realization spread through the ranks. Demaratus, the exiled Spartan, had warned Xerxes before the battle. Now Xerxes asked him a question that revealed his fear. How many more of them are there? Demaratus looked at the dead immortals, looked at the carnage, and replied, "There are many great cities in Greece, but there is one called Sparta, and in that city there are 8,000 more men just like these." The color must have drained from Xerxes' face. He had spent days and 20,000 lives to kill 300. If he had to fight 8,000, he wouldn't have an army left to conquer anything. So yes, Thermopylae was a tactical defeat for Greece. The pass was lost. Athens would burn. But psychologically, strategically, the Persians had already lost, because now they weren't marching as conquerors. They were marching as men who knew they could bleed. A stone pillar was later raised at the site of the battle, carved with words from the poet Simonides. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Thermopylae was, by definition, a defeat, but it became the most expensive time ever purchased. Those 3 days bought just enough time for Athens to evacuate, just enough time for the Greek fleet to regroup. A few weeks later at Salamis, Greece shattered the Persian navy, and 1 year later at Plataea, the prophecy became reality. Sparta finally mobilized. Not 300 men, thousands, led by Pausanias, Leonidas' nephew. The full Spartan war machine smashed the Persian invasion into the dust, and the world changed. Because that sacrifice didn't just save a country, it saved an idea. It preserved Greek democracy, art, philosophy, the fragile foundations of what we now call Western civilization. We don't remember the Spartans because they won. We remember them because they showed the ultimate definition of freedom. Freedom isn't just living without chains. It's being able to look at overwhelming odds, at certain death, and still have the will to say no. When Leonidas shouted "Molon Labe," he wasn't just talking about weapons. He was talking about dignity. He was saying some things are more valuable than life itself. Today, a modern statue of Leonidas stands at Thermopylae, and beneath his bronze feet, those words are still carved in stone, a warning to tyrants, a promise to the free. Come and take them. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this journey, you're clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and uncomfortable truths of our past. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we have a lot more forgotten history to uncover together. And before you go, here's my question for you. In a modern world where safety is often treated as the highest priority, do you think the Spartan mindset still has a place today? Or is it a dangerous relic of a violent past? I'll be reading your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of